Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that weave together paranormal aspects with murder mysteries, and they are all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com or at jrericksonauthor.com. They are in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Susan Berman grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. She was the daughter and only child of Las Vegas mobster Davy Berman. Her mother was an ex-showgirl. Her father died from a heart attack after having surgery when Susan was just 12 years old, and her mother died a year later, possibly from an overdose, although it seems Susan later thought it was suicide. In childhood, Susan was unaware that her father was a higher-up in the mob and helped run the popular Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Later, she would be referred to as a mob princess. After the death of her parents, Susan was shuttled between boarding schools and other family members. She had a big personality and was described as quite needy. While attending UCLA, she met Robert Durst, who was there studying for his master's degree. She and Bob became instant friends, and they would later even refer to each other as brother and sister. After graduating from UCLA, Susan went to New York as a working journalist. In New York, her and Bob's friendship only deepened, and when he married Kathie, the three of them often spent time together. Susan had a loud, boisterous personality, and she loved to be the center of attention. Susan was, like Bob, also a bit eccentric. She had a range of phobias and just seemed kind of like an odd duck. She also started to research her family while she was living in New York, discovering more about the Las Vegas Mafia and her father's high position of power within that organization. Susan embraced this aspect of her past, even framing a photo of her father's mugshot. She openly told pretty much anyone she met about her upbringing as the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster. In 1981, Berman wrote Easy Street, a memoir of her childhood growing up as the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster. The movie rights were later purchased by Hollywood Studios, though the movie was never made. Susan and Bobby were always very close, and after Kathie vanished, it was Susan who spoke to the press, letting them know that Bobby was distraught and that she was handling the media in his place. Susan eventually moved to California, hoping to become a screenwriter, but she was never able to sell any of her screenplays. Her life took a downturn as she went in and out of marriages and struggled with money. After Kathie's case was reopened in New York, several of Kathie's friends told Detective Becerra that he needed to speak with Berman. Many of her friends were convinced that Susan was aware of what Bob had done to Kathie and may even have helped him cover up her murder. When the papers started reporting about the case of Kathie Durst being reopened, one newspaper stated that Susan Berman had agreed to an interview. In the weeks after the case was reopened, Robert Durst would send Susan 2 checks totaling $50,000. On December 24, 2000, less than 2 months after the press had reported the reopening of Kathie's case, officers were summoned to Susan's Benedict Canyon home after a neighbor called to say that Berman's dogs were outside in the street barking. Police discovered the back door of Susan's home standing open. The floor was dotted with bloody paw prints. They found Susan Berman shot and killed in the back bedroom. she lay face down in a pool of blood. A single bullet to the back of her head had killed her. There were no signs of robbery or forced entry in her home. Another disturbing aspect in Susan's case that would appear just days after her body was found was a strange note sent to the LAPD. It was postmarked the day that Berman was murdered, which was one day before her body was discovered at her California home. It stated that there was a cadaver at Susan's address. Original theories that Susan's death might be a mob hit were largely dismissed with the arrival of this note. After all, a hitman wasn't going to notify the police that a dead person lay in the house. If anything, it's to the killer's benefit for the body not to be found for a longer period of time, since that degrades evidence. But in the case of someone who cares about the victim, they may feel disturbed at the idea of leaving the body there in the house, especially knowing that perhaps one of her friends or a family member might then be the person to discover her body. This created the theory that Susan's killer was someone who knew and cared about her. The lack of forced entry and the lack of theft also made it likely that Susan knew her killer and let them into her home. Kathie's family and friends, as well as New York investigators, were stunned when they learned of Susan Berman's murder. For many of them, suspicion immediately centered on Robert Durst. For the LAPD, their suspicions too turned to Durst when they discovered that he had paid Susan $50,000 in the 2 months before her murder. He also did not attend Susan's funeral. Investigators tracked Robert Durst's movements around the time that Susan was killed, and they discovered that he was in fact in the state of California when Susan was murdered. Susan had also told friends that Bobby was coming to visit sometime around the holidays. They could place Bob in California, but they could not place him directly in Los Angeles at Susan's home. On the 23rd of December, the day that Susan was murdered, Bob Durst got on a 10 p.m. flight in San Francisco and flew to New York. The drive time from LA to San Francisco is approximately 6 hours, which is plenty of time to have murdered Susan in LA and made a 10 p.m. flight to San Francisco. Still, the Los Angeles police had little more than that information to go on, so they really did not have a case against Robert Durst. The murder and dismemberment of Morris Black was probably the most outwardly disturbing of Bob's crimes, but in truth, that's only because we don't know exactly what unfolded with Kathie Durst in 1982. If we did, the true horror that is Robert Durst might have been known 40 years ago. As it was, the murder Durst finally went to trial for was a strange one indeed. When Robert was apprehended, he had again dropped off the radar, an act which largely seemed to be a result of the reopening of the investigation into Kathie's disappearance, followed by the subsequent murder of Susan Berman. Little did people know what he'd been up to in the interim. On September 30th, 2001, just shy of 20 years since Kathie Durst went missing, and a little less than 1 year since Susan Berman was shot and killed, a 13-year-old boy in Galveston, Texas, made a gruesome discovery. While fishing at a pier with his stepfather and sister, the boy looked down into the water to see what he initially thought was a dead pig. As he studied it, he realized it was something much worse. A human torso was floating in the bay. Police were summoned and they pulled trash bags with more body parts out of the water. However, they did not find a head. In addition to the arms and legs, they discovered receipts and mail, which ultimately led them to the address of a rundown apartment house in Galveston. As they interviewed the people who lived there, they learned about two residents who each occupied one of the home's ground floor apartments. One was a 71-year-old man named Morris Black. Police knew that the body they'd found in the bay was an older white man, and they wondered if it might be Morris Black. They found out that the other occupant was a middle-aged, deaf-mute woman named Dorothy Siner. As police looked through windows into the apartments of both Black and Siner, they could see evidence of a crime scene, including drop cloths and smeared blood. In the trash behind the house, they found a receipt for an optometrist with the name Robert Durst. Investigators contacted the optometrist and asked that they call if Durst returned to pick up his glasses. The Galveston police didn't have a clue who Robert Durst was, but they wondered if he might be involved in the murder, and they wanted to speak with him. The eye doctor summoned police when Durst arrived for his glasses. When the investigators pulled Robert Durst over, police looked through the back window of his vehicle and saw a bow saw. Durst was booked on a murder charge, and bail was set at $250,000. Durst had appeared disheveled, and police were clueless about his substantial wealth. He mostly looked like a homeless guy. Within 24 hours, Bob Durst posted bail and disappeared. On October 16, 2001, Robert failed to show up for court to face charges for the murder and dismemberment of Morris Black. Durst had once again fallen off the radar. Still, Bob would not stay hidden for long. His own seemingly uncontrollable impulses would bring him back to the surface. On November 30th, 2001, just 6 weeks after he failed to show up in court, Durst was arrested for shoplifting a sandwich and several Band-Aids from a grocery store in Pennsylvania. Mind you, he had $500 in his pocket. When he was arrested, Durst had shaved both his head and his eyebrows. In 2003, Durst went on trial for the murder of Morris Black. You'll remember that the second occupant of one of those Galveston apartments was a deaf-mute named Dorothy Siner. Well, Dorothy did not actually exist. Dorothy was Bob Durst in disguise. Sometime after Kathie's case had been reopened, Bob Durst started working to disappear. He did this by purchasing wigs and women's clothes. He moved to Galveston, Texas, rented the rundown apartment next door to Morris Black, and started pretending to be a woman who could not speak. He communicated with people by writing notes. His disguise was shoddy at best, and many people who encountered him knew he was a man dressed as a woman. But since he was in Texas, a seeming world away from New York, none of them connected him to the eccentric millionaire wanted for questioning in his wife's disappearance. I'd like to say that justice finally caught up with Robert Durst in Galveston, Texas. But as so often happens in murder trials where the defendant has massive amounts of money, Durst paid nearly $2 million for a team of lawyers who were experts at twisting the truth. One issue that arose was that Morris Black was not a man who would have been missed. He was a drifter, described by many as cantankerous and abrasive. What drew the two men together is hard to say, though I'd imagine on some level Durst was attracted to Black's willingness to openly berate and attack people. Durst had his own hatred for people, but he hid it. His hatred was only unleashed in the quiet, in the dark, when no one was looking. Black, on the other hand, was openly hostile. The defense made it very clear that Morris Black was an unlikable man. They painted Durst as frail, scared. He'd been falsely accused of his wife's murder in New York, and he was being hunted by a power-hungry DA, that being Janine Pirro. When Morris Black confronted Durst with a gun, according to Durst's testimony on the witness stand, he did nothing but defend himself. The gun went off and Morris Black was dead. Sure that he'd be blamed for Black's death as he'd been blamed for Kathie's disappearance, Robert Durst dismembered the man and dumped his body in the bay. Still, what jury would acquit a man who dismembered someone? Well, this one did. They found Robert Durst not guilty of the murder of Morris Black. It's easy to fault the jury here, and a lot of people did, but you have to remember they are privy only to the information being put forth to them. In this case, Bob Durst made a very compelling case for himself, and his slippery lawyers did the rest. There are plenty of other cases that have played out similarly. In fact, O.J. Simpson comes to mind when I think about this jury acquitting Robert Durst after he cut someone into pieces and threw their body into the Galveston Bay. Once again, that might have been the end of Bob Durst's story. He clearly had the means to disappear, and he wanted to disappear, and yet he cannot seem to do it. Though both New York and LA police were interested in Durst for the murders of Kathie Durst and Susan Berman, they still didn't have solid evidence to take him to trial. Still, his story intrigued people, and one person in particular took an interest in Robert Durst. Andrew Jarecki produced the film All Good Things, based on the life of Robert Durst and the disappearance of Kathie Durst. The movie was released in 2010, and much to Jarecki's surprise, he received a call from Robert Durst. Bob told Jarecki he'd seen the film and liked it. As Jarecki talked to Durst, he came up with another idea. He wanted to create a documentary about Bob that would include interviews with the man himself, a chance, perhaps, for Bob to tell his side of the story. This documentary, called The Jinx, was released by HBO in 2015. A lot would be revealed in The Jinx, much of it told by Bob Durst himself. But it was not Bob's story that riveted watchers. Jarecki revealed the deep rift that existed between Robert and his brother Douglas, the brother who had taken over the Durst organization. It became clear in the film that Bob was seen as much more than a nuisance by Douglas. Douglas was downright scared of Robert, and it was pretty easy to see why. On multiple occasions, Bob had shown up at Douglas's home. One time, he'd even had 2 guns in his car. On The Jinx, Bob Durst, when asked about Douglas, said he didn't get along with him, making a comment that Douglas stole his toys when they were young. This was largely said in jest, but it was clear that their dislike for one another had less to do with a childhood rivalry than it did with Robert's own inability to function in the world. Douglas at one point hired a bodyguard to protect him against Bob. Robert, during the filming of the documentary, asked the camera crew to videotape him in front of Douglas's home. Although Bob is not acting threatening in this segment, this behavior is part of what makes Bob so unnerving. He likes to play with people. Douglas was concerned enough about Bob that he had a protection order against him. At one point, Bob was arrested for violating that order when he showed up at Douglas's house and walked up to his door. In the final episodes of the documentary, Bob starts to pull away from the film at the same time that Jarecki and his crew are making some disturbing discoveries. One discovery comes from Susan Berman's stepson, Sarib Kaufman, who'd been assisting with background on Susan for the documentary. Sarib was also somewhat friends with Bob Durst. Susan was still very close with Sarib at the time of her death, though she was no longer married to his father. In fact, Sarib had spent time with Susan in the weeks before her murder. After Susan died, Sarib received most of Susan's papers and personal belongings. As Sarib was looking through Susan's papers, he came across a note that had been sent by Bob Durst to Susan at her home in Beverly Hills. As he stared at the envelope of the note, he made a chilling discovery. The writing on the envelope nearly perfectly matched the writing that had been sent to the LAPD, telling them that a cadaver was located at Susan's home. Not only did the handwriting look identical, the individual who wrote the cadaver note even misspelled Beverly Hills the exact same way that Bob had when he'd sent Susan a letter. This was a shocking moment, even to me, the viewer. The similarities in the writing are remarkable. A forensic document specialist in the documentary also confirmed that it was highly likely that Durst wrote the cadaver note and sent it to police. In The Jinx, Andrew Jarecki confronts Robert Durst with the evidence of the two nearly identical notes. Durst is clearly unnerved as he studies these two notes, commenting on how the writer misspelled Beverly the same way. He admits that he wrote the envelope addressed to Susan, but he denied that he wrote the note sent to the LAPD. Still, his mannerisms reveal that he is anxious about this comparison. Moments after we see this comparing of the notes, The Jinx comes to a pretty mind-blowing end. And the documentary ends with a voice recording of Robert Durst. And basically, what happened is Robert Durst would mumble to himself a lot. So after he was shown these notes and the video ended, his microphone was still attached to his shirt and he went in to use the bathroom. He is in the bathroom speaking to himself, and we hear Bob Durst say, quote, "There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This is a slightly abbreviated version of what he said. There are a few other things in there, but those are kind of the big impact moments. Jarecki and his team didn't find this recording until months after they'd finished filming the documentary, when they were assembling the documentary, and they were absolutely shocked when they heard Robert Durst make this admission in the bathroom. Ultimately, it would be this admission by Robert Durst combined with the similarities in the notes that would give police the evidence they needed to go after Bob for Susan Berman's murder. Robert Durst was arrested in 2015 in New Orleans for the murder of Susan Berman. In 2020, the trial for the murder of Susan Berman started in California. One revelation that quickly came out was Durst's admission that he had in fact wrote the cadaver note. However, his attorney claimed that while Durst wrote the note, he was not guilty of Berman's murder. The Los Angeles DA does not buy the story. They believe that Bob killed Susan to silence her before New York detectives could interview her about the unsolved disappearance of Kathie's wife. Again, Kathie's friends had long suspected that Susan might have helped Durst cover up the crime, including telling him about the Pine Barrens as an ideal burial spot to hide a body, because remember, this was a popular spot for mafia to dispose of bodies. And not only was Susan part of a mafia family, but at the time of Kathie's death, she was investigating that part of her past, and she would have been very aware of this place. They also believe that Susan may have posed as Kathie and called in sick to the dean at her medical school after she vanished. According to an NPR article that I read, the district attorney in California had done a 7-year investigation and had amassed more than 2,000 exhibits and identified over 100 witnesses that prosecutors would be calling to testify against Robert Durst. That trial is still currently underway as I write this. I'm pretty much finished with the facts of the case, but I am going to talk about Durst himself now and sort of my own thoughts about the case, my own thoughts about Durst, and some other things that he has done or that people believe he has done that I will talk about. One thing that struck me as I dove into the crimes of Robert Durst was the sloppiness of his later crimes. The note with Susan Berman written in his own handwriting and sent to police. The murder of Morris Black in an apartment in a house he occupied with other people. The dismemberment happening right there in his apartment. And then receipts thrown in the trash bags with the body. Not only that, Durst easily could have escaped with all the money he had, but he was apprehended for shoplifting. What these things sort of said to me was that Bob Durst really had a sense of invisibility. He'd gotten away with things for so long, he'd lost touch with how close to apprehension he was. How many crimes and likely murders had he committed to become so lax in his behavior, so convinced that he wouldn't be caught? Another thing that points to the likelihood that Robert had murdered before was the dismemberment of Morris Black, which was described as having been done with surgical-like precision. This was clearly not Durst's first time. Something that came up often in my research that I haven't mentioned until now was that Durst had a series of dogs who disappeared or died mysteriously. He named each of these dogs Igor, and later, during a jailhouse recording, Durst could be heard on the recording saying that he wanted to quote Igor Douglas. Investigators believed he'd murdered multiple of his dogs and was using their names as his code word for murder, or essentially saying what he wanted to do was murder and potentially dismember his brother Douglas. Most true crime listeners will know that animal torture and murder is one of the traits often associated with serial killers. There were a lot of things working in Robert Durst's favor that allowed him to get away with murder, potentially far more murders than we know about. He was small, soft-spoken. People considered him likable and gentle. The truth, though, is that that aspect of Durst is just one piece of his personality. We know that he beat Kathie Durst. He pulled her from a couch by her hair in front of her whole family. There was a story that came out from her neighbors in the penthouse in New York that at one point he had locked her out of their penthouse apartment on the balcony, and she had to crawl to a neighbor's balcony and knock on their door to be let back inside. We also know that Durst murdered and dismembered an elderly man in Texas. Bob's money allowed him to fly under the radar. He also changed his appearances frequently, his locations, and he lied constantly. Even in the early years of Kathie and Bob's marriage, he disappeared for large periods of time, and he never offered any explanation for where he went. There are clearly gears turning in this man's head all the time. He's intelligent and meticulous. At one point, when Kathie found Polaroids of their apartment, Robert admitted to her that he'd taken them to conceal an affair he was having. He said he rearranged everything in the apartment to make it appear that he was single when his mistress visited, and then he moved it back precisely to where it was so that Kathie would be unaware of what he was up to. Think about the level of calculation that goes into something like that. It also reveals how detailed the world is for Robert Durst. A person who doesn't notice the minute details wouldn't assume that other people do. I think that's one of the challenges with Bob. It takes such an excessive level of awareness to arrange these murders in the way they appear to be arranged. In Kathie's case, the implication is that he murdered her, he took her body to New Jersey, he cleaned his home, he asked Susan to call the dean and pretend to be Kathie and say she was ill. He misdirected police by saying she'd returned to New York and then reported her missing in New York, which kept detectives from looking too closely at the house in South Salem. He set up a similar series of misdirections in Susan's murder, flying into an area of California far away from her home, then not using his phone for several days to ensure he wasn't tracked. He booked a flight on the day of her death that was 6 hours from her home to give himself an alibi. He left no physical evidence behind. Ultimately, the only thing that got him caught was the note that he sent to LAPD. So again, I think in most cases, investigators are used to criminals who are not so diabolical, who are not forward thinking enough to set up this kind of elaborate ruse to cover what they did. Robert Durst was not your run-of-the-mill kind of guy. The more I read about him, the more I saw links between him and other serial murderers that I've read about. According to Durst's brother, Douglas, again, one of the reasons that he was supplanted in the family business was because he had begun peeing in wastebaskets in the office. Another serial killer who did something similar was Herb Baumeister, a murderer that I covered in episodes 9 and 10, which were the Fox Hollow murders. Herb was a sexually motivated murderer who killed more than 10 men in the Indianapolis area and left their corpses on the wooden property behind his home. He too had been fired for repeatedly peeing on his supervisor's desk. Likewise, Robert Durst was arrested in Texas after he relieved himself on the checkout counter at a CVS. Durst was also a seemingly pathological thief. Another murderer who regularly stole things was Ted Bundy. In both cases, the stealing was not out of need, but seemed more like a compulsion, or perhaps part of their desire to see what they could get away with or to subvert authority. While Durst was incarcerated awaiting his trial for the murder of Morris Black, he lost weight so that he appeared more frail to the jury. That reminded me on some level of Ted Bundy and how he used to wear arm or leg casts to appear less threatening to his victims. Durst also rehearsed his testimony while in his cell and then asked his then wife how it sounded. And yes, Durst did get remarried at one point, and I chose not to cover that because there is simply so much information about the Durst case that it would have taken me ages to get through it all. And honestly, his second wife seemed like a minor character of convenience, and you can read more about her online. But in a recorded jail phone call that Robert made to his wife, he asked her how he should look when he walked into court. Should he smile, etc.? What this immediately brought to mind for me was the inability for sociopaths or psychopaths to feel real emotion. Their displays of emotion are merely them modeling what they see around them. Thus, he needs input to know the appropriate way to act in a situation where he can't easily glean cues from those who are around him. Andrew Jarecki in The Jinx talked about how Durst reached out to him and complimented him on the film All Good Things. Bob even said something along the lines of, "You know Robert Durst better than me," something like that. I don't know the exact quote, and I'm not going to go find it right now. Robert clearly liked the way he was portrayed in All Good Things, as a man so disturbed by witnessing his mother's death and later by his overbearing father that he acted out in violent and disturbing ways. Few people would consider such a portrayal a positive one, and yet I wonder, is it positive to Robert Durst because he truly knows all that he has done? What lies in his dark core. the horrendous acts he's committed. My instincts when considering someone like Robert Durst is that he's killed far more people than anyone will ever be aware of. Unlike non-psychopaths or sociopaths, some killers eventually confess because they feel guilt or remorse. They want to ease the families of their victims' suffering. In the case where a person doesn't feel those emotions, they'll easily take their secrets to the grave. They feel no emotional pull toward unburdening themselves or easing another's pain. Their singular impulse beyond committing murder and essentially owning or power over another person is to appear a certain way to the world. They don't want anyone to know who and what they truly are. I believe that's why Durst was attracted to his portrayal in All Good Things. For him, it was favorable to what he actually was. Thus, the motivation to hide his dark deeds is far more powerful than any motivation driven by conscience. And again, this is a movie that strongly implies that Bob Durst murdered his wife and either murdered or hired the murder of Susan Berman and then also murdered Morris Black. Many other people who know Bob Durst as well as investigators also believe it is highly likely he's killed more people than the three that he is associated with. Again, those three being Kathie, Susan, and Morris. One person who comes up as a possible victim of Robert Durst is a girl named Karen Mitchell. Karen Mitchell was a teenager who disappeared from Eureka, California in 1997 after she left the shoe store where she worked. Robert Durst was living in the area at this time. A witness saw Karen get into an older model vehicle with a man, and when that witness helped create a composite sketch, the man looked alarmingly like Robert Durst. Investigators discovered that Durst frequented the shoe store where Karen worked. He also visited a homeless shelter where Karen sometimes volunteered. Investigators haven't found hard evidence linking Durst to Karen's disappearance, but having looked at the composite sketch, the similarities are definitely pretty shocking. Another young woman who investigators have wondered if Durst might be connected to was 18-year-old Lynn Schultz, who vanished from Middlebury, Vermont on December 10, 1971. One of the last places Lynn was seen was at a bus stop on Court Street. She was eating prunes that she'd purchased from the health food store All Good Things. Does that name sound familiar, All Good Things? It should. It was the name of Andrew Jarecki's film based on the life of Robert Durst. And Jarecki got the name from Durst's actual health food store that he had previously owned in Vermont. So, yeah, this pretty young woman vanished shortly after she visited the store owned and run by Robert Durst. She left her ID, checkbook, and all of her personal belongings at her dorm. And other than the sighting at that bus stop, Lynn was never seen again. There are more young women that investigators have wondered if Durst might be connected to, and I'm not going to go into all of them. Again, you can search online. I think Lynn and Karen are the two primary because there's evidence that Durst was there at the time. And again, my instincts would be that they're right. Somewhere in Durst's life, he learned how to dismember a body with surgical precision. Sometime before Kathie disappeared, he learned how to cover up a crime and hide a body. The first murder Durst is largely credited for is his wife Kathie in 1982. But again, at the time of Kathie's death, Bob Durst was 38 years old. A lot of serial killers tend to start killing in their mid to late 20s. So if Robert Durst was a serial killer, did he truly start with Kathie? Or had he potentially been murdering people for 10 to 15 years before he even met Kathie. So I could go on and on, as I already have, about Robert Durst. I had not originally intended to do an episode about him, but I actually watched The Jinx a couple years ago, and I had seen All Good Things sometime before that. And recently I bought Matt Birkbeck's book about the Durst case, and that was kind of what inspired me to cover the case in my podcast. And in particular, I wanted to cover Kathie McCormick because she was an example of someone who came from a regular family and she just disappeared, and there have never been answers for her, and that is very sad. If you want to know more about the unsolved disappearance of Kathie Durst or about the life and crimes of Robert Durst, there are a ton of sources online, some of which I'll link to in the show notes, including The Jinx, which is on HBO, so I'm assuming you need to have a subscription in order to watch that. All Good Things is also currently on HBO. I don't know how long that will be there. I will say The Jinx was mesmerizing. I do think it left out some of the facts and perhaps it portrayed Robert in a more positive light than he deserves. But Jarecki was looking at Robert Durst from a different perspective than most other people had before. The true crime book, A Deadly Secret, written by journalist Matt Birkbeck, was really a deep dive into the missing persons case of Kathie, as well as Robert's future crimes. And that book was largely from a law enforcement perspective. It's clear that Birkbeck had access to detectives who worked on the case. That being said, the narrative in A Deadly Secret really goes off on some tangents, and it feels like it targets Janine Pirro, the DA in New York, as well as some of Kathie's friends like Gilberta Najeme. And honestly, that bugged me. Gilberta in particular, there were a lot of things in the book that sort of described her as a publicity seeker and implying that she was trying to capitalize on Kathie's case. But the reality is that when Kathie disappeared, Gilberta was putting herself on the line. She was digging through Robert Durst's trash. She broke into his house. She was hounding investigators. There was no benefit to be had for this woman from doing those things. In fact, she was doing those things at potentially great risk, considering who Robert Durst's family was and how much trouble she could potentially have gotten into. I also think anyone who is willing to stand up and fight for a victim should be applauded, and that's the bottom line. So I was not a big fan of that aspect of the book. I will also say that we really got some deep insights into the lives of some of the detectives working on Kathie's missing persons case, but we didn't get a lot of insight into Kathie herself, and that felt disappointing to me. But overall, I did find A Deadly Secret to be very informative. I don't want to bash the book. I think it gave a really solid foundation from which to consider what happened in Kathie's case. I also watched the Dateline coverage of the case, which was Robert Durst, an ID murder mystery. And I'll link to that in the show notes. And then I read a whole bunch of articles, which I will also link to in the show notes. When it comes to cases like this, everyone has an opinion, myself included. The best thing you can do is consume all the material you can find. And in this case, there is a ton of material, and come to your own conclusions. My conclusions, honestly, is that Robert killed Kathie Durst, Susan Berman, and Morris Black, and he probably killed a lot of other people that we will never hear about. Sadly, Kathie's mother, Ann McCormick, died at the age of 102 without ever knowing what became of her vibrant 29-year-old daughter. that pretty much sums up what I have about the disappearance of Kathie McCormick, as well as the murders of Susan Berman and Morris Black. Thank you for listening and have a great day. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.